Just kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time. Haven't felt like this, my dear, since can't remember when. It's been a long, long time. You'll never know how many dreams I dreamed about you, or just how empty they all seem without you.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Back in Time Watch Restorations. My name is Wayne, and I want to thank you all for tuning into the channel. In this episode, we're going to be working on a watch that I have a personal connection with. This is a watch that belonged to my grandmother. Her name was Annie Mae. And this is a watch that was a gift to her from her husband, my grandfather. His name was Alvin. Now, we know this watch was a gift because it has an engraving on the back of the case that says, "Love, Alvin." Now, we're not quite sure of the provenance of this gift, whether it was a birthday, anniversary, or maybe even a Christmas gift. But during this episode, we're going to see if we can do a little investigative work and try to figure that out. Now, this watch was found in my grandmother's possessions after she passed away, and my father held on to it for nearly 30 years. And he recently texted me and sent me some photos of this and asked me if I wanted it. And I told him absolutely. I would love to take this watch, restore it, and breathe some new life back into it. Now, this is going to be an interesting project for me, as I have never worked on a lady's wristwatch before. And as you might imagine, ladies' wristwatches are much smaller than men's. And this is going to present some challenges. The parts are extremely small, and I'm going to have to use some heavy magnification here. And I'll probably be using my smallest set of screwdrivers to take this apart and reassemble. All right, let's go ahead and get started. And to do that, I need to remove the movement from the case. And I'm going to use my case knife to press against a little notch at the bottom of the case back and press upwards, which allows me to start moving the case back away from the top half of the case. And I can move my case knife along the edge, and now I can peel away the top of the case. Now, the movement is still inside the case back, so we need to remove that. And I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure against the crown to see if we can get this started. And there, it starts to come up a little bit. And if I use my fingers, I should be able to pry the rest of this out of the case back. There we go. Set that aside. And I want you to take a look at this. I can fit this movement on the tip of my finger. That's just how small this watch is. I have to say, I am a little intimidated here. This is the smallest watch I have ever worked on. So this is a pretty little movement. Look how compact it is. You don't see a lot of decorations, but I would imagine that's expected on a watch this small. But this is a watch movement was made by a company called Longines. It's a 5LN movement, and we'll do a little research on that later on. Let's put a little wind into the movement and see if it's actually running. Turn the crown a little bit. Okay, so the balance is spinning, and the watch is running, although it doesn't look like it's getting great amplitude. So hopefully when we service this, that'll take care of that. Okay, so let's flip the movement over and let's remove the hands. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay a piece of plastic on top of the dial, and this will protect the dial as I'm removing the hands with my levers. There we go. And with those removed, we can take them and set them aside. It's hard to explain just how small these parts are. They're hard to grab even with my tweezers. So with the hands removed, I can now remove the dial. And to remove the dial, I need to first loosen 2 screws on the side of the movement. These are the dial screws, and they press against feet on the bottom of the dial, which secures it to the movement. These are really small screws. And I am officially using the second smallest screwdriver in my set. Okay, with those two screws loosened, I can now gently lift the dial off of the movement. And to do this, I'm going to place the head of my screwdriver in between the dial and the movement, and I'm going to gently press and push the dial away from the movement, a little bit at a time. This is an exercise in patience, because if I do this too fast, I can end up scratching the movement unnecessarily. And that's the one thing about this hobby that really will test your patience. For those of you that know me, patience is not my strongest virtue. All right, we're almost there. And there we go. Okay, with the dial removed, we can set it aside, but before we do, I'm going to place this into a dial protector. So it's a little contraption that I have that suspends the dial, keeps it safe. I've also placed the hands in here, and it's just a good practice to set these aside and make sure they're protected. The dial is the face of the watch, and it's what everybody sees when they look at it. Now with the dial safely secured, I'm going to go ahead and start the disassembly of the movement. And I'm going to go ahead and first place the movement into the movement holder. The movement holders I had didn't do a great job of securing the movement, so I went off online and purchased the smallest one I could find, and this is what you see here. And I think it does a pretty good job. We'll have to try it out. So I was really struggling to use magnification with a loupe to work on the movement, so I decided to use my microscope. And I forgot to turn on the lights on my microscope, so some of these first shots are a little dark, and I apologize for that, but it's only temporary. I still think you can see this sufficiently. And I am seeing a little bit of rust, surface rust on the movement, and that does concern me a little bit. It does look like there was a little bit of moisture that got into the movement. Ooh, you can see here on the bottom left corner, I'm seeing a lot of surface rust covering a screw, and then over by the balance, I do see some rust. Oh, now I'm seeing the setting lever. It does have quite a bit of surface rust on here, so we'll have to take a look at this as we take the watch apart and see which parts were compromised by the rust. Luckily, I do have a donor movement that I purchased just to harvest parts from in case we need them. So I just removed the Canon pinion with my Presto tool, and while I'm on the side of the movement, I'm going to go ahead and remove the keyless works and the motion works. Now the function of the keyless works is to let the watch owner set the time on the watch and wind the mainspring or add power to the movement. It allows you to do this from a single crown. So when you pull the crown out and turn it, you set the hands, and when you push the crown in and turn it, you're winding the mainspring. So I'm going to remove the minute wheel and this intermediate wheel next to it. And these are part of the motion works, which are responsible for transmitting the power from the gear train on the other side of the watch to the hour hand and to the minute hand on the dial side. So they're pretty critical in the timekeeping function. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm removing the yoke spring and the yoke. And you really have to be careful when removing the yoke spring, as it is a small part. It's under a fair amount of tension, and if you're not careful, it can fly off your desk, and it's really hard to find. So you can see that I'm using a small piece of pegwood here to pin down the spring as I am removing it. And I almost have a death grip on this because I have had these fly off before, and I can't say I enjoy crawling around on all fours looking for parts. But we got it off successfully without any issue. All right, so we're going to flip the movement over to the other side, and we're going to remove the balance and the train of wheels. But this particular movement has an arm or a bar that extends from the balance cock over to the train wheel bridge. I'm not sure what function it serves. It's more like a guard or something, but it's held in by 2 screws, and once I have these removed, I should be able to remove the bar. Super tiny screws, as you can see here from the scale with my tweezers. And with that screw removed, I should be able to remove the bar now. Okay, with this arm removed now, I now have access to the balance cock, which holds the balance wheel. And this is secured to the movement with a single screw. So once I have this screw removed, I should be able to remove the balance assembly from the movement. Now on most movements, the balance is the first component of the movement that you want to remove first. And the reason why you want to remove it first is it has a part called the hairspring. And the hairspring controls the back and forth movement of the balance wheel. And the hairspring is actually a very tiny part that is very fragile, easy to damage. So it's considered best practice to take this off and set this aside for safekeeping. And these can be very tricky and very easy to damage. So you can see I'm trying to be as gentle as I can as I'm removing this. Now, as I'm removing parts off of the movement, I'm starting to see where the moisture made its way through the movement and caused rust. And the majority of the time, as is the case here, moisture comes in through the crown. And especially with a watch like this, where there isn't really any form of protection system in place to keep water out of the crown, it's very easy for that to happen. Now, I don't think this watch was submerged in water or anything like that. What I think probably happened is the watch was exposed to a high humidity situation and water came in that way, or moisture came in that way. It could have been that the watch was in the bathroom when someone was taking a shower or something like that. There's just not a good protection system in place on this type of watch. Now, you can see what I'm doing here is I'm removing the barrel bridge. Normally, I would take the crown wheel off first before doing this, but there doesn't appear to be a way to remove the crown wheel from this side of the movement. You can see there are 3 shiny points in the middle of the crown wheel, but I don't see a way to remove it. So we'll look at the back side of this part once it's removed. Okay, so with the screws removed from the bridge, we can remove this. We got a little gravity assist there. What I want to do is I want to flip this part over and see how that crown wheel is held in place. And yeah, you can see there are 3 screws holding that crown wheel in place from this side of the part. And I can tell you the end of those screws must be highly polished. You can also see some rust there and the click spring. All right, so let's take out the barrel. This holds the mainspring. It's what powers the watch. And now we can remove the train wheel bridge. So let's talk a few minutes about the company that made this watch. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this watch was made by a company that is called Longines. Longines is a Swiss company based in a small town called Saint-Omer, and they are still in business to this day. But they have been around for a long, long time, and they have a very rich history. The company was founded in 1832 by a man named Auguste Agassiz. Auguste was a local businessman and banker, and he started the company with 2 partners, Henri Regel and Florian Morel. The original name of the company was Regel, Jeune and C. By 1846, both Henri and Florian had retired from the business, leaving Auguste as the head of the company. But within a few years, Auguste's health began to fade, and around 1852, he brought his nephew, Ernest Francion into the company to help him run the business. Now, Auguste remained a partner in the company until his death in 1877, but Ernest would take over leadership of the company starting around 1867. Now, Ernest is often credited by many for much of the company's success over the next few decades. This is due to some of the decisions that he made and innovations he oversaw under his leadership. First, in 1866, he purchased land just south of Saint-Omer and built a factory in an area known as Les Longines, which means the Long Meadows. And this eventually became the modern-day namesake for the company. Now, another change that Ernest made under his leadership was to modernize the company's manufacturing processes. During the time period Ernest took over the company, Swiss watchmakers were using a very traditional manufacturing process, where the production of individual components was distributed across various specialized workshops. Once these components were completed, they were sent to a central workshop where watchmakers would assemble the parts into finished watches. Now, Ernest would oversee the company move to a fully integrated manufacturing approach, where all aspects of production were done in-house under one roof. Now, these changes allowed the company to produce much higher volumes of watches while still maintaining very high quality. Now, these innovations, along with many others, led to significant growth and prominence for the company. And by the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, Longines became the largest and most successful watchmaker in Switzerland. Moving into the first half of the 20th century, Longines was well known across the world for the quality and precision of their watches, and the company became renowned for their aviation watches and chronographs. Many famous and historical figures were known to wear Longines watches. This includes names like Albert Einstein, Amelia Earhart, Howard Hughes, and Charles Lindbergh, just to name a few. Now today, Longines is owned by the Swatch Group. This is a company that owns 17 different Swiss watch brands, many of which you may have heard of, such as Omega, Blancpain, Tissot, Glashütte, and Hamilton. As part of a strategic move in the 1990s, the Swatch Group repositioned many of their brands to focus on different market segments, and the decision was made to have Longines focus on the entry-level luxury market. This decision allowed Longines to compete in a more accessible luxury market segment, but allow an emphasis on maintaining high quality, but offering a more affordable price compared to ultra-luxury brands like Omega and Rolex. Now, I've barely scratched the surface here on the history of the company, but for those of you that are interested in learning more, I'm going to include some links down in the notes below where you can learn a lot more about the history of the Longines company. All right, so let's transition back over to the disassembly, and you can see that I'm now at the stage where I am removing the mainspring from the barrel. Now, there is a process that I usually follow when I'm removing the mainspring from the barrel, and what I normally do is get the first couple inches out of the barrel and then try to work the mainspring out using my thumbs. But the size of the barrel is really small, and this I have to admit I am struggling a little bit with this to get it going. So we may try a different approach here. And as you can see, the mainspring just kind of flew out of the barrel. And that's one of the reasons why you really want to wear protective eyewear when you're doing this, because even though the mainspring is not wound, it's still under tension. And it can be dangerous when it flies out like that. So with the movement completely disassembled, I'm going to turn my attention to removing some of the surface rust that we found during the disassembly. And to do this, I'm using a piece of pegwood to lightly rub the surface rust off of the main plate. Pegwood is a softer material, and my hope is that it will minimize any damage to the movement as I'm rubbing it. But as I found, the pegwood really wasn't very effective. So I got out my fiberglass pen, And the fiberglass pen has small strands of fiberglass that do a much better job of getting into the small grooves and removing the surface rust. Now, I've used the fiberglass pen before and it's really effective, but it does have a tendency to leave very small scratches. But luckily, most of the rust that I found is in places where these small scratches would not be visible. So, consider myself pretty fortunate here. All right, so I've removed as much of the surface rust as I can from the movement. So now I'm turning my attention to the pivots on the gear train. And I'm using a silicone-based product called E-Flex to remove any residual oil and dirt that may be left over after I've removed the gear train from the movement. And this is a product that I just started using. It's recommended by another watchmaker on YouTube, and I really like it, so I've made this part of my process. Okay, with the pivots clean, we're going to move on to my favorite step in this process, and that's cleaning the parts of the watch in a bath. And I decided to use some baskets here that had a little smaller mesh on them. Some of these screws are really, really small, and the basket that I normally use has a little thicker mesh on it, and I was a little worried about some of the screws maybe sliding through that mesh. So I have these 4 smaller baskets from Bergeon. They have a much finer mesh, and I'm using those to place all the parts into. And those go into a much larger basket, which I normally don't use in my cleaning process. All right, so this is my watch cleaning machine, and it has 4 different stages to it. The first stage is this brown solution, which is a solvent, and it's really good at removing dirt and oil. And I'll wash the parts in here for about 5 minutes, and then I'll put it through 2 rinse cycles using the other jars. And then the last container is a dryer. It has a heating element, and it heats up the parts and dries off any remaining rinse solution. So while these parts are bathing, I want to take a few minutes and see if we can solve the mystery of this gift, and see if we can figure out when my grandfather gave this to my grandmother. To do this, I need to first figure out when the watch was manufactured, and I can do this by using the serial number on the movement. If we go back and look at the movement, we can see that the serial number is 6417230. Let's see what we can find out using this number. Now, there are several public databases available that you can use to look up the manufacture date. You can even pay Longines to provide you this information with a certificate of authenticity. However, I've decided to use serialnumberdecoder.com, which you can use for free. So I'm plugging in the serial number, and we can see that this watch was made in 1942. Now keep in mind, this is an approximate date. Okay, let's take a look at the information we have and see if we can figure this out. We know the watch that was manufactured sometime around 1942. Now, I did a little research on the internet to see if I could figure out what the average inventory turnover rates were for Swiss watchmakers during this time period. There wasn't anything definitive, but most estimates indicate around 6 to 12 months. However, one thing that I read that was mentioned multiple times, that the inventory rates took a lot longer to sell due to World War II, which was being fought during this time period. So to be conservative, I'm going to say this was sold sometime between 1944 and 1945. So using this as my target, I looked to see if there were any significant events during this time period. Luckily, I found 2 milestone events which I think are pretty good suspects. First, my grandmother was born in 1915. So this means in 1945 she would have celebrated her 30th birthday. Now, the second thing I found was that my grandparents were married in 1935. So in 1945, they would have celebrated their 10-year anniversary. Now, I could be completely wrong about this, but I think these 2 events are the most probable. Based on what I know of my grandparents, they lived a very modest lifestyle, and they didn't make extravagant purchases like this. And if you factor that and the engraving on the back of the watch case, my best guess is this watch was purchased by my grandfather to celebrate their 10-year anniversary. We'll probably never know for certain, but this is the best we can do with the information that's available. All right, thanks for walking through that mystery with me. The parts are out of the cleaner now. They're all nice and clean. And here they are laid out nice and neat on my bench. And at this point, we're going to start putting the movement back together. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the mainspring back into the barrel. The first thing I like to do is to add a couple drops of oil on the inside of the barrel. Now, I'm not going to be installing the mainspring that came out of the watch. I looked at the metal. It looked, based on the color of the metal, I believe it's original to the watch, so it's pretty old. And it's a good idea when you're servicing a watch this old to replace the mainspring. It's one of the first things that breaks. So I ordered a new one, and here it is. It comes in this little cylinder. And all you really have to do is take the end of your tweezers and press the spring into the barrel, just like you see here. Takes a few attempts, but it eventually slides right into the barrel. Now, with the mainspring into the barrel, the next thing I need to do is to reinstall the barrel arbor. This is the small metal part in the center of the barrel that the spring wraps around, and it's what winds the mainspring. I have this little pin vise that I purchased that is specifically for installing arbors like this, and it makes the job much, much easier. All right, with the barrel arbor in place, we can now reinstall the barrel lid. The first thing I want to do before I install this is I put a few drops of oil on the inside of the barrel lid. I'll also put a couple drops of oil on the top of the barrel arbor, just to make sure that the areas that rub against the barrel lid are properly lubricated. And now I'll put the barrel lid back on top of the barrel, but I have to align. You'll see that there's these notches on the barrel lid, and these have to line up. At least one of these has to line up with a certain part of the mainspring. So we'll look to get these notches lined up appropriately with my tweezers. And then what we'll do is we'll bring the cap in and press the barrel lid back into place. Just like that. All right, I've moved the main plate back over to the movement holder, and you can see I'm using a slightly larger movement holder to give myself a little more stability on the reassembly. And now I'm adding a couple drops of oil where the barrel will make contact with the main plate. So we'll get the barrel back in place, and now we can begin installing the gear train, or the train of wheels. And I'm going to take the pivot for each wheel and install it into the corresponding jewel. Try to get it aligned, as you can see here. Now, in my last video, someone asked me, what is a jewel and what does it do? Well, a jewel is a synthetic ruby, and it acts as a bearing. Its job is to reduce friction on the train of wheels. If you can reduce friction, you can get better and more reliable timekeeping. So that is what a bearing, that is what a jewel is and what its function is. And different movements have different number of jewels. I believe this particular movement has 17 jewels, but oftentimes on vintage watches and watches that are made today, you'll see a jewel count stamped on the movement. And that corresponds to the number of jewels that are actually used on the movement. You can see that I have 3 wheels installed. I've got the escape wheel, I've got the 4th wheel, I've got the 3rd wheel, and right now I am lubricating the 2nd wheel, which is also called the center wheel. And the center wheel makes contact with the mainspring barrel. And it transfers the power from the mainspring barrel down to the other wheels in the gear train. So the center wheel also has the pivot which the hands on the watch will attach to. And it rotates once per 60 minutes. All right, so I've got the train wheel bridge now, and I'm going to line up the jewels with the pivots on the top of the gear train. And it's important to get these lined up before you tighten down the screws, as we don't want to bend any of the pivots on the gear train. So I'm using a little stick here to make sure that everything is aligned and turning freely. And this is exactly what you want to see right here. Luckily, I'm using my microscope so I can actually see the pivots inside the jewels. It makes it much easier when you can see that level of detail. So this particular bridge is held down by 2 screws. We'll get those in place, and then we'll get those screwed down. So you'll notice that I continue to use the stick to apply a very light pressure on top of the bridge. And the reason why I do that is if you screw down without using some light pressure, it is possible for the bridge to slide up a bit and for the pivots to fall out of place. And if you don't recognize that this has happened, it's very easy to bend or break off one of those pivots. They're very small, as you might imagine. So it's always a good practice to apply just a little bit of pressure on these bridges as you are screwing them down. Now I have installed the setting lever screw, and we'll move forward with installing the barrel bridge. Now you will notice that the crown wheel is already installed. I did install that off camera. I did remove that for the cleaning process, but did notice that this video was getting rather long, so I decided to do that off camera. Now the barrel bridge is secured to the main plate with 2 screws. And once we have these in place, we will get our screwdriver and we will secure this down. Once the barrel bridge is secured, I'm going to add a little bit of oil where the barrel arbor sticks through this bridge. This is a friction point, and we want to make sure that we have this lubricated to reduce the friction. And once the oil is in place, we can reinstall the ratchet wheel. The ratchet wheel is turned by the crown wheel, which is turned by the crown. When a watch owner turns the crown, it rotates the crown wheel, which in turn turns the ratchet wheel. Now you can see here that the ratchet wheel is connected directly to the barrel arbor. If you recall, when we installed the mainspring and the barrel arbor, the mainspring is wrapped around the barrel arbor. So that is what turns and tightens the mainspring for the watch. So that's how the watch is powered. Well, this is held down with a very polished screw. With the ratchet wheel in place, I'm going to put the click. I'm going to install the click. Now the function of the click is to prevent the ratchet wheel from reversing. You put a wind in the mainspring. The ratchet wheel wants to turn back in the opposite direction. The click prevents that. Now it's called the click because of the sound it makes. If you've ever wound a mechanical watch, you know it makes a clicking sound when it's wound. And that sound is the click making contact with the teeth on the ratchet wheel. Now, it is amusing if you ever watched an enthusiast wind a watch. Many will actually hold that watch very close to their ear as they're winding it because they want to hear this sound of the click making contact. It provides some sort of audible sensation that watch enthusiasts really love. We're going to move on and install the rest of the escapement here, and I will start with the installation of the pallet fork. Now the pallet fork has a pivot, and that pivot needs to go into its corresponding jewel, but I do want you to notice the two stones here on the pallet fork. There's an entry stone and an exit stone. And these make contact with the feet on the escape wheel. And if you've ever listened to a watch that's running, you hear a tick and a tock. Well, that noise, part of those noises come from these pallet stones making contact with the escape wheel. So you may also remember earlier in the video I mentioned there is a certain number of jewels in a watch. Well, these stones on the pallet fork are also jewels. They're synthetic rubies. And if you see that your watch has 17 jewels, just know that 2 of those come from the pallet fork. So I am installing the pallet fork bridge, and it's responsible for holding down the pallet fork into place. It has a jewel in it for the upper pivot of the pallet fork, and it is held down by 2 screws. Now I'm going to bring my stick in again, and I'm going to apply some light pressure on top of this bridge as I tighten down the screws. And the reason is exactly the same as the train wheel bridge. Very easy for that pivot on the pallet fork to slide out of its jewel, and if you don't recognize when that happens, it's very easy for you to bend or to snap the top of that pivot off. And if that happens, you're going to have to buy a new part. And on some of these vintage watches, parts can be very hard to find. All right, so we flip the movement back over in the holder, and we're going to reinstall the MotionWorks and the Keyless Works. But before I start adding gears in place, I'm going to add a little bit of oil to some of the posts. And you can see that I've added a little too much oil here. I've got oil in the wrong location. So I'm bringing in another little watchmaker tool called Rodico. And Rodico is kind of like watchmaker's silly putty. If you ever played with silly putty, it has the same consistency as that. But it's a kind of an all-purpose tool. You can use it to remove oil. You can use it to clean parts. You can even use it to hold parts into place. It's kind of a multifunctional tool. With the excess oil removed, I can put the intermediate wheel in place, and we'll test to make sure that this is turning smoothly. Now this intermediate wheel contacts with the sliding clutch, and it turns the minute wheel, which is what I'm installing here. And these 2 gears work together to help me adjust time on the dial if I pull the crown out. Now the minute wheel also works with the hour wheel, and it reduces the turn ratio on the hour wheel down to once per 12 hours. This ensures that the hour hand only turns once every 12 hours. Now what I'm doing here is I'm putting a little grease on the winding pinion. Now the winding pinion turns when the crown is pushed in and the watch owner turns the crown. And it makes contact with the crown wheel, which in turn turns the ratchet wheel, which winds the mainspring. So that's why when you're winding a watch, you want to have the crown pushed in. And you notice that I was adding some grease to the gears on this winding pinion, and it was a little thicker grease. It was a blue grease, and we use that type of grease for these parts that are metal on metal, that have a lot more friction on them. So what I'm doing now is I'm installing the sliding pinion, or the sliding clutch as it's also called. And this is what makes the determination whether I'm winding the watch or I am setting the hands on the dial. And it works in combination with this part we call the yoke. And the yoke is held up by a spring when we're fixing to install that. Now, this particular operation always makes me a little nervous because I have lost a few of these springs. And I will hold the spring down with my stick here, but this is something that has to be handled very delicately, because if I don't hold this spring down properly, I'm fixing to put some tension on the spring and it can fly off, and you may never see it again because it is that small. And now with that done, I can put the setting lever spring in place. And you'll notice this doesn't really look like a spring, but it is. It puts a little tension on the setting lever. So when I pull the crown out and push it back in, this is what provides that tension. And you can see that it's held in place by 2 screws. It also serves another function as kind of providing a little bit of a guard for the minute wheel as well. So while I'm screwing this down, I want to point out something you may have noticed. There's now a crown tube installed on this movement. I found this on my donor movement, and I've installed it over here with the hopes of using it to block out any moisture from getting into the movement. We're going to use this with a different style crown and see if that works. I did a test fit with the case, and it seems to fit just fine. So we'll see how it goes. Now what I'm doing here is I'm installing the balance wheel and the balance cock. And I have to install the balance wheel at a certain angle so the impulse pin at the bottom of the balance wheel makes contact with the pallet fork at just the right angle. So that's why I'm turning the balance cock now, so that impulse pin will make contact. And I put a little bit of wind into the mainspring. So let's see if we can get this started. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to get the balance cock settled at just the right angle. Oh, look at that. It fired right up. That is exactly what we want to see. And what's even more promising is it looks like it looks to have pretty good amplitude here. That's exactly what we want to see. Now the balance cock is held down by a single screw. So we're going to get that in place, and we're going to tighten this all the way down in the hopes that when we get this tightened all the way down, that the balance wheel continues to spin with the same degree of amplitude. Okay, that went well. So now we're going to put the movement on my time grapher. And the time grapher is kind of like an EKG for watches. The time grapher tells me exactly how the movement is performing. So you can see that the watch is currently gaining a little over 2 minutes a day. We have 210 degrees of amplitude, and we have a very high beat error of 2.9 milliseconds. So I need to correct that. All right, after making some adjustments, you can see that I'm getting a much better beat error now. I have 217 degrees of amplitude, and it's gaining and losing a few seconds a day, and that is tolerable. That is something for a watch this old, that is really not that big of a deal. Okay, now I've got the movement up and running and performing well. I'm going to turn my attention to the case. It's time to put some shine back into this case. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a little piece of pegwood and try to clean up some of these parts a bit before I start cleaning them and removing some of the tarnish on them. I found it's just good practice to clean these parts off and get some of the bigger pieces off before you put it in the ultrasonic machine. The ultrasonic machine is more effective when you do this. I would also say that for some reason I'd find this oddly satisfying. There's just something about taking a little piece of wood and cleaning up small parts and getting them clean again. It's just, like I said, oddly satisfying. All right, so before I put these parts in the ultrasonic, I'm going to try to clean off some of the tarnish. And I'm using a chemical here. This is a household chemical called Tarnex. And it's used for cleaning jewelry, cleaning other items made of gold and silver. And it reacts with the tarnish on the watch and does a pretty good job of removing it. So I let this sit for a few minutes, and then I wash it off in some distilled water to get all the chemical off. And we'll let it sit in the distilled water for a couple minutes. So now I'm going to put the case and the case back in my ultrasonic and clean it with a detergent called Liquinox. And we'll let these parts sit for about 15 minutes, and then we'll pull them out and we'll put them in some more distilled water. So I just wanted to show you a shot of the bottom of the basin of my ultrasonic cleaner after the bath, and just how much dirt and grime came off of that little tiny bracelet. Shows you just how effective the ultrasonics are. Look at that's 80 years of dirt and grime. So there's one more step I want to take with the bracelet and the case. I purchased this polishing cloth, and this is a polishing cloth you use on fine metals, such as gold and silver. And I'm using it to lightly polish the surface of the case and the case back in an effort to remove some of the finer scratches, also to remove any remaining tarnish that the Tarnex didn't take off. And I sped this up a little bit so you didn't have to watch me do this in real time, but this is the final step I'm going to follow in cleaning the bracelet and the case. Okay, I'm going to turn my attention to the dial, and I've put the dial back under the microscope so we can take a better look at its condition, and you can see that it has seen better days. We obviously are seeing that some of the moisture made its way onto the dial and caused a little bit of damage. Unfortunately, most of this damage is not visible at normal magnification, but I'm using a piece of Rodico here to clean up any dirt and debris off the dial. But there's really not much I can do here. There's not much I can do to restore this dial. But I did want to show you another dial from the donor movement, just to kind of give you a sense of how much the quality has degraded over the 80 years. I was tempted to swap out the dials here, but this is not the dial my grandmother used to tell time. So something just doesn't feel right about that. So I'm going to keep the dial original. All right, so I put the dial back onto the movement, and now I'm using my hand press to reinstall the hour hand. And this press, what it does is it helps me keep the hands perfectly perpendicular as I'm installing them. I am having to use an eye loop here to see what I'm doing, but this is a really handy tool to get the hands on it just the right angle. So now I'm putting on the hour hand, and we'll get it lined up at the 12 o'clock position, and we'll use the same hand press to get this installed. Just like the hour hand, we want to make sure that the minute hand is installed at just the right angle. That way it doesn't come into contact with the hour hand. So the watch crystal was not in the best condition. It had a lot of deep scratches on it. Just didn't look right. I tried to find a replacement for it, but just couldn't find one that matched the right dimensions. So what I'm doing here is I am using several different grits of sandpaper to remove those scratches, and we're refinishing the crystal. So I'm starting with a very coarse grain sandpaper. I think I started with like 800 grit sandpaper, and then I'm working my way up to higher grains, and I work my way all the way up to 2500 grit sandpaper, which was very fine grain. And each of those grains removes different levels of scratches on the crystal. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to use this other polishing compound called Poliwatch. Now, Poliwatch is a liquid polishing compound, and it's good at removing very fine surface scratches on acrylic crystals like this. And you can see that I'm using Rodico again to hold the crystal down in place while I use this polishing compound. This is just yet another example of the usefulness of the Rodico. You can use it for a lot of different things in watchmaking, and holding parts is one of them. All right, let's see how we did. All right, I have to say that turned out really well. I don't see any of the scratches that were there when I started this, and that looks really, really clear. That's going to look good once it's installed. With the crystal polished, it's time to put it back into the case. But before I put the crystal in the case, I want to apply some adhesive. So I have this cement that I purchased online. I found it to be a little tricky to work with. It's creating some little spider webs, if you will. But what I'm trying to do is work this into the edges where the crystal will set. And this will keep the crystal from popping off and will hold the crystal down with just the right amount of adhesive. So with that done, let's go ahead and put the crystal in and see how it fits. To say, this is looking really nice. I really like the way this watch is turning out. Nice fit. Okay, we are on the home stretch. So one of the final steps in the process is to recase the movement. And what you can see here is I have the movement and I'm trying to place it into the case back. Now I am struggling a little bit here because I can't hold the movement at just the right angle with some of these finger cots on, but I am managing. And there you go. It is now in the case back. And with that done, I can now place the front of the case onto the case back. Oh man, that does look nice. You can't even see those scratches on the dial. That is beautiful. Oh yeah. Look at that. I think this turned out great. I am very pleased with the results here. Okay, my wrist is far too fat and hairy to model this wristwatch, so I got some help from my lovely assistant. I think it looks great on her wrist. So this is a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for coming along for the journey. I hope you'll give me a like and a subscribe. Please do. It really does help. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Just kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time. Haven't felt like this, my dear, since can't remember when. It's been a long, long time. You'll never know how many dreams I dreamed about you, or just how empty they all seem without you. So kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long